And Oren, are folks still locked out?
Yes.
Okay.
We are live. Let me unlock the meeting. Wow. Okay. Welcome to those joining. Welcome. We're getting started in about 5 minutes. Welcome for those just joining. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Give everyone just one more minute to join. All right, welcome everyone. We're gonna get started here. Welcome, welcome, good morning and good evening. And my name is Oren, my pronouns are he or they. We'll do some introductions in a minute, but I'm the host today and I'd like to welcome you. Thank you for joining us to Red Line, Green Line, Resisting Colonial and Racist Land Policies in Jerusalem and San Diego. A few technical things. While there is no sign language, no ASL interpretation or closed captioning today, we are recording today's event and we will publish a version with captions as soon as we can. And if you have a question and you're on the Zoom, please use the Q&A feature. It's a button at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. If you're on the Facebook, you may also use the live stream chat and we will try to answer those questions. And before we go any further in, a quick land acknowledgement. For those of us joining from the San Diego area today, we know that we are on stolen Kumeyaay land. and especially given today's topics, including colonialism and land theft, we want to acknowledge the Kumeyaay people for stewarding their ancestral homelands since time immemorial. And we will also have a few updates later today on regarding the Kumeyaay-led fights against the ongoing theft and cultural erasure happening just about an hour's drive from the Pacific coast, where the Bureau of Land Management is overseeing the dynamiting and building of border walls atop of previously undisturbed sacred burial grounds. And we have a nice sized crowd today already joining us as we welcome friends and neighbors new and familiar to us on today's call. We'd also like to thank you for taking the time today to join us amid such turbulent times for so many of us. We wish everyone good health and freedom from state violence and police violence. And with that, we'd like to read just a quick few lines from the June 2020 open letter by the Black, Indigenous, Jews of Color, Sephardi, and Mizrahi Network, followed by a brief moment of silence before we jump in. So from the letter, we write to you at a juncture when the centuries-long oppression of Black people in this country and around the world can no longer be denied or dismissed. We write at a juncture when simply echoing the calls rising through the clouds of tear gas around the country is not enough. The current uprisings led by Black people demand concrete commitments that are significant and long-lasting. The systems of violence and inequality responsible for police brutality are deeply seated in our society, and it will take time and commitment to undo them. We must come together to fight the notion that violent policies targeting some communities could somehow create safety for other communities. We must question mainstream Jewish institutions' alignment with law enforcement. We must also challenge the ties between US police departments and the Israeli police and Israel Defense Forces. They are inexorably linked through the exchange of training and oppressive tactics that result in harm to Black people, people of color, and immigrants in our own cities, and Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories. More policing and militarization will never make our world safer. The onus is on us to reimagine safety and create a world where the safety of some is not premised on the brutal oppression of others. And we'll paste that link in the chat briefly, but we should also note that in addition to the JVP, Black, Indigenous, Jews of Color, Sephardi, Mizrahi Network, that letter was also signed by Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, JFREJ, Never Again Action, Researching the American-Israeli Alliance, RAYA, and If Not Now. And with that said, a brief moment of silence. Thank you. The program today is about 90 minutes. There will be 3 panelists and then questions and answers. And we'll first introduce everyone that you'll hear speaking today. So we'd like to begin by inviting Fayrouz Sharqawi.
Thank you. Good morning, good noon, good evening. I'm Fayrouz Sharqawi, and I am the Global Mobilization Coordinator at Grassroots Al-Quds, or Grassroots Jerusalem. Grassroots Al-Quds is a platform for Palestinian community mobilization and networking in Jerusalem. Our goal is to help create Palestinian long-term strategies for Jerusalem.
Thank you. And Monique?
Good morning, everyone. Monique López. I am a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. JVP San Diego is one of 70 all-volunteer chapters of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a Jewish-led grassroots movement with over 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. And here in San Diego County, about 2,000 of those members reside here. Jewish Voice for Peace is an anti-Zionist organization and endorses the call from Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, as part of our work for freedom, justice, and equality for all people. Jewish Voice for Peace believes that the time-honored nonviolent tools proposed by the BDS call provide a really provide a powerful opportunity to make that vision real. I'm also here as a practicing planner as well, and someone who teaches planning history. So I'll be providing some of that context as well.
Thank you, Monique. And Ed.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ed Swede. I live in San Diego, La Jolla, actually, a suburb of San Diego. I was the founding member with my wife of JVP San Diego about 5 years ago, and we were chapter 36. It's nice to hear Monique tell us that JVP now has 70 chapters. I'm also on the board of Karama. It's a local nonprofit organization that sponsors the annual Arab Film Festival in San Diego, and we promote Arab and Muslim causes, particularly Palestine issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And thank you, Ed and Ethel, and everyone else who is involved in the formation of the Jewish Voice for Peace chapter. My name is Oren. I've been a member, supporter, volunteer, organizer with the Jewish Voice for Peace chapter for about 5 years as well. And I think with that, we'd like to jump right in. So today's event, Red Line, Green Line, was inspired, in fact, by Grassroots Jerusalem, Grassroots Al-Quds, who gave a powerful webinar a little over a month ago with incredible framing around connecting military, tourism, and colonization. And you're going to hear about their book as well that draws these connections, and learn more how to donate and support their work and purchase the book shortly. And one last acknowledgement though, before we dive into the conversation, is another member of our local JVP San Diego chapter, Gary Fields, who is also professor at University of California, San Diego. He could not be here today, but he also contributed to the framing. He's the author of a book called Enclosure, Palestinian Landscapes in a Historical Mirror, where he investigates the shared lineage of how maps and laws and walls have dispossessed both Palestinians and indigenous peoples of what we now call the United States, and the origins of this history. And Gary's book reminds us, as it's been said, that history may not always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so we hope this conversation today helps you to hear some rhymes. And with that, Monique, will you start us off with a little history of land planning?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Oren. And thank you everyone for taking some part of your Sunday to be with us here today. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. And I'm gonna do my best to share about 500 years of history in 5 minutes. And I think this is really incredibly important because it sets up the narrative for redlining here in the US. Oftentimes when people talk about redlining and the conception of it, they'll start with the 1930 maps that were developed by the federal government to shut people out of certain neighborhoods and to enclose others in others. But I want to start us back in thinking about the doctrine of discovery, actually, in 1493, which was this doctrine that provided the quote unquote legitimization of those who were white and Christian to occupy and take land, and really also justification to transform the landscape to their liking. And enslave people, both indigenous people and people from the continent of Africa as well. Here in San Diego and in California, that doctrine was further manifested through the mission system. Here in San Diego, there is a mission, and that dispossession of land for the Kumeyaay here occurred, and the enslavement of those people occurred here, and the genocide as well occurred here as well. And so this is also part of this lineage and system of occupation in this land that we live on here today. If we speed on forward, so we went from 1493 to the 1700s. We're moving towards 1840s, 1850s with Manifest Destiny. Again, Manifest Destiny provided this assumption that the Americans not only considered the westward expansion as a desirable objective, but an endowment from God through which they could take their democratic republicanism across North America. Again, this led to folks colonial settlers from the east moving west and squatting, forcibly removing indigenous peoples from the west, either through violence, but then it would then require the US federal government to bring in troops to protect those squatting settlers as folks moved west as well. And then with that, much later, we have in the 1860s, the Homestead Act, where essentially the West was parceled out into these squares where the US government sold off land very cheap for individuals to take as well. That leads us to essentially a time in the early 1920s and 30s, where redlining is really predicated upon this dominant narrative that some people have the right and access to control land and control both people and place. Here you see a redlining map of San Diego. The red indicating areas in which folks that were Black, folks that were, non-Black people of color as well, would be required to live. They did not have access to any of the yellow or blue areas. These areas were deemed as quote unquote undesirable areas. They would put, and still to this day, there's that legacy of toxic sites being nearby, but also really disinvestment from these areas as well. And that legacy still continues today. So you have communities such as Logan Heights, parts of City Heights, and Southeast San Diego. What this did is it didn't allow people, Black and non-Black people of color, to purchase homes outside of these areas, but then also those individuals had very limited access to capital in order to maintain and upkeep their homes within those areas as well, where others in more the yellow and blue zones had more of that opportunity to do so. And we'll get into the specifics of that legacy as we continue the conversation today. And Ed will also share some personal context as well.
All right, thank you, Monique. And I think we'd like to actually share as well some context. Fayrouz has prepared us as well some maps and history regarding the origins of the term green line, but also just broader context. So Fayrouz.
Yes, thank you, Monique. This was a great introduction. I already heard the rhymes, the legitimacy from God that justifies colonization, squatting, very similar to outposts here, the hilltop boys starting a squat on the top of a hill in the West Bank, and then the Israeli army occupation coming to protect these few individuals, and immediately infrastructure starts being built and so on and so forth. So even with a very short but very rich introduction, we already could see and hear some of those rhymes and parallels. And yes, I would like to share some maps that show how I am going to focus on Jerusalem. Not the whole of Palestine. I'm going to focus on Jerusalem and how Jerusalem's borders and lines changed throughout the last a bit more than a century. So I'm going to share a few maps and very quickly go over this, try to provide this context as well. So this is the first map, and this is how Jerusalem looked like up till 1947. And these are the borders of the Jerusalem Governorate under the British colonial rule. I mean, it's important to say that we, the Palestinians, have never really dictated any of these borders, not the ones before 48, nor the ones after 48. But this is the original Jerusalem district. And as you can see, it includes also the city of Jericho. And if you look at the red line over here, this red line just indicates the city itself, Jerusalem city, and the suburbs around the old city, neighborhoods and suburbs around the old city. Next is, Jerusalem after the Nakba. After the 1948 war, what happened in Jerusalem was the occupation and ethnic cleansing of the western part of the city. So speaking of the red line in San Diego, here is the green line introduced for the first time. By the way, the green line refers to the line that was drawn on the actual map at the ceasefire meetings and negotiations between the newly born state of Israel and Jordan, and they used a green marker on the map, and that is where the name came from. But as you can see here in Jerusalem, the green line is the line that divides 48 occupied Jerusalem from 67 occupied Jerusalem. And this line did have or bear a meaning, an actual meaning and physical weight between 48 and 67. That is the time when Israel controlled this part of Jerusalem. The other part of the map was part of the bigger West Bank that fell under Jordanian control and remained under Jordanian control until 1967. In 67, Israel occupies the rest of Palestine and occupies the rest of Jerusalem. And as you can see, the Israeli occupation authorities redraw the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. And suddenly from the big district we saw before, the Jerusalem municipal boundaries included this part of the city. Now, this is not to say in any way that there was not greed or that there aren't plans for the rest of these lands. But it was the moment in 1967 when different legal statuses were created or given to different lands. So whatever is within the municipal boundary of Jerusalem is where Israel started applying its civil law, not the military law, like the rest of the West Bank. Again, you can see the green line, but it's important to realize that in 1967, the green line lost all meanings. I mean, that the green line today exists in the rhetoric of the two-state solution, of international law's definition of what is occupation, what is an illegal occupation, definitions that are very much narrower than our definition as Palestinians, as indigenous people in this land. We consider all of Jerusalem occupied. We consider all of Palestine occupied. And so the green line by itself, the day it was given this importance as the internationally recognized border, it was already unfair to the Palestinian aspirations, goals, narrative. Nonetheless, it is still used today. Even when we see that the two-state solution is dead and is not really going to happen, still we hear lots of speakers, lots of politicians, lots of human rights NGOs and United Nations talking about the green line as if it does have a meaning. Walking around Jerusalem today, you don't see the green line. You don't see a border, you don't see a fence, you don't see checkpoints on the green line, you see checkpoints beyond the green line, annexing de facto more and more land. Next, I want to jump to 1993, and that is the year that the Oslo so-called peace agreement, the Oslo Accords, were signed between the Israeli occupation government and the newly born Palestinian Authority. And again, if you look at the map, there is the green line. And according to the Oslo understandings, the whole two-state solution direction, this is supposed to be the line between Israel and Palestine, independent Palestine. But as you can see, the blue line is the Jerusalem municipal boundaries, where Israel controls land policies, land laws, Israeli civil law is applied. They are all beyond the green line. And again, even after Oslo also failed to change this situation of Israel controlling all of Jerusalem. And then the last one is, the one before the last is the Jerusalem map after the wall, because there is the green line, no meaning, no weight. There is the municipal boundary, which does have a meaning. The blue line is where, if you are a Palestinian and if you live in this territory, then you hold what we call the Jerusalem ID. The Jerusalem ID is the residency status. because when Israel occupied Jerusalem, the eastern part of Jerusalem, it gave the Palestinian residents a residency status, an Israeli residency status, which is basically a permit to live in the city. I'm not going to go into details, but please, let's put a side note here. It's the first tool of displacement that was planned to displace Palestinians. It's not used to permit Palestinians to live in Jerusalem. It is used to kick Palestinians out of Jerusalem. So the blue line, which is the municipal boundary, is much more important than the green line in our daily lives, in our life, in our political context. The green line bears no meaning. The blue line does bear a meaning. But in 2003, Israel started building the wall, the annexation and expansion wall, which is the red line on this map. And as you can see, the wall is much wider. The borders of the wall are much wider than the borders of the green line for sure, but also the municipal boundaries. And so the border today, the actual border, the physical border, the 8-meter tall concrete wall is the red line. So again, it's funny. I mean, we did not think about San Diego when we made this map at Grassroots Al-Quds, but here you go, a red line in Jerusalem as well. The last map is the Greater Jerusalem Plan, which is the future plan for Jerusalem. So up till now, I showed you maps that showed historic development. This map shows the aspirations of the colonial Israeli regime. This is what they are planning for Jerusalem. They have been planning for Jerusalem for more than 3 decades now, and it's a plan to create a metropolis, the Greater Jerusalem metropolis, that will not only include Jerusalem, but also the big settlement and colonial blocks around it. The Adumim colonial block around Ma'ale Adumim in the east, the Giv'on colonial block, which is up north near Ramallah, and also the Etzion block, the Gush Etzion settlement block in the south near Hebron. So as you can see, there is always another plan and another map, and the line grows wider and bigger, and that reflects the plans, especially long-term ones for Jerusalem. Wow. I think I'll stop here, and we can go back to some laws and policies regarding this after.
Thank you, Fayrouz. Yes. Wow. There's so many parallels, and another thing I'm chewing on that was in Gary Fields' introduction to his book is what Edward Said called the colonizers' imaginative geography, right? Mm-hmm. And how these maps end up transforming landscapes, right? So we've taken a look at a lot of big maps and talked about a lot of kind of big picture geographic changes. And we want to try to hone in on what these experiences have looked like and felt like in both places. And so we'd like to begin that conversation by inviting Ed to share the story of the deed to, Ed, your own house.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm sitting in my office in La Jolla Shores, California, a suburb of San Diego. I'm a block from the beach. My wife and I saved as much as we could. We were 2 school teachers. And we were able to buy this little house by the beach in La Jolla Shores. And when I read the deed, I was taken aback. And I decided I needed to do further research on the language in the deed, which I'll read to you in a few minutes. So I visited the La Jolla Shores Historical Society and asked, do you have any data on the La Jolla Shores subdivision? And here's what we found. In the 20s, this tract of land of 200 or 300 houses was subdivided by developers and put up for sale as, lots for beach cottages, small homes by the beach, promoted in Los Angeles, where lots of people had money, but not to the Hollywood types. Hollywood, was heavily Jewish in those days. And so there was quite a strain of anti-Semitism in all of this. And the developers put together a brochure, La Jolla Shores, and down here it says, Home of Your Dreams. And the promotional brochures has this language in it, including the restriction of ownership or residence to members of the Caucasian race. That was the promotional brochures for the lots here in the 20s and early 30s. So I have the deed to my house, And I know you probably can't read it, but I'm going to read you this little paragraph, which of course is still in the deed. That no part of said tract at any time be lived upon by any person whose blood is not entirely that of the Caucasian race. Yes, the word blood is in the deed. But if persons not of the Caucasian race be kept thereon by a Caucasian occupant, strictly in the capacity of servants or employees actually engaged in the domestic service of the occupant, or in the care of the premises for the occupant, such circumstances shall not constitute a violation of this conditioning. This is called a restrictive covenant, and they were all over San Diego and probably all over the United States, although I haven't really researched the rest of the United States. And when they say Caucasian, they mean Jews, Arabs, the whole lot of us. So this was in force until 1948 when the Supreme Court struck it down. And they basically said the covenants which remain in the deeds have no force of law. But here in La Jolla, they didn't like Jews very much, let alone blacks or the rest of us. And so the La Jolla Board of Realtors, to support the community's feeling about it, developed a telephone system where they would warn each other if a Jew was looking for property in La Jolla. And this was after the 1948 rule. And they further had an agreement that if they were forced to have a Jew or a Jewish couple in the back seat driving to look at a property, the driver, the realtor, was to put a green card on the dashboard of the car to alert the seller that Jews were coming. And this continued into the 60s. And UCSD, the major university just up the hill from my house, was developing and recruiting Jewish professors. And one of the founders of the UCSD complex, Roger Revelle, one of the houses is named after Roger Revelle at the university, he demanded to meet with the Board of Realtors, and it's quite a famous meeting. He went in there and said, look, we're developing this university and you have to make a choice. You can have a first-class university with Jewish professors, or you can have your anti-Semitism. And then a Board of Realtors person got on television, kind of tore up his green card, and that was the end of the green card system. So I often talk to friends of mine that it's really thanks to an activist like Roger Revelle that Ethel and I could have purchased this house in 1982. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, and as we reflect on not only the activism side of it, but just the impact of these exclusionary laws, I want to turn it back over to Fayrouz to talk a bit more about the types of policies and laws experienced in Jerusalem.
Yeah, well, again, parallels. While Ed was speaking, I was thinking about the latest developments regarding Israeli laws about the Jewish state and the nationality law, which is very similar. It's not about house deeds per se or green cards or permits, but it's the same because it is translated into other laws and other policies that discriminate against non-Jews in this case. And of course, this is true for Palestinians who are citizens, who hold the citizenship, the Israeli citizenship, who live in 48 occupied lands, but also residents like the Jerusalem Palestinians. But speaking about specific Israeli laws and policies, I think the first one I will mention is the 1950 absentee property law, which is a law that was legislated in order to help the Israeli occupation authorities take over Palestinian property that belonged to Palestinian refugees who were expelled and displaced during the Nakba. 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from Palestine as a result of the 1948 catastrophe or Nakba. And these Palestinians owned lands, they owned farms, they owned businesses, they owned homes. And mostly in villages, homes were destroyed and lands were declared state lands. And lands and homes, especially inside cities. For example, if you take a walk around the western part of Jerusalem today, you will see many of those beautiful Palestinian homes that were built in the western part in neighborhoods like Al-Talbiyya and Al-Qatamon and Al-Baqa and others, that whose owners were expelled by force, and these homes were not destroyed. They were not demolished like villages around Jerusalem, but rather used by the Israeli occupation authorities. So the 1950 law, the absentee property law, basically declares that Palestinian refugees are simply absent. They are not there. It's not because they were expelled by force. It's not because they are not allowed back in, because the Israeli law of return does not does not allow the return of anybody who is not Jewish. Here is another law that is based on that, not blood, but religion. And so the houses were given by the Israeli authorities to settlers and to institutions, and there are so many of them today. Everywhere you go and see them in Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Jaffa, Jaffa, and so here is one law. But moving forward to 1967, in 1967, Israel occupies the eastern part of Jerusalem, and then it starts to set its control in stone by legislation and policies. So the first thing that they do in 1967 is expand the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, and we saw those on the map, and started applying the Israeli law within these boundaries. And since the beginning, they started making master plans, long-term plans for Jerusalem. The first one that was put for Jerusalem after the 67 occupation, both west and east, was the Jerusalem 2020 plan, which was a 50-year development plan looking at the year 2020 with goals for Jerusalem. And it was the first plan where the Israeli occupation talks for the first time about the so-called demographic balance in Jerusalem. And the demographic balance in Jerusalem, as this plan stated, was 70% Jewish, 30% non-Jewish. So here we have a state that does not miss the chance, showing off being the only democracy in the Middle East, that actually has official documents that say, and official statements by politicians and decision makers that say that they wish to limit the number of a certain population in a certain city. In this case, again, the terminology is theirs, Jewish, non-Jewish, but of course it means Israeli and Palestinian. And so the Israeli plan, the Israeli goal is to limit the number of Palestinians in Jerusalem. I can even take it a step forward and say that there is probably some plan somewhere that talks about 100-0 rather than 70-30. I don't think that's the final plan, but this is the plan that basically started or paved the way for all of the policies that followed after. I would like, if you allow me, to read a quote from the Israeli occupation municipality's main city planner in 1977. His name was Yisrael Kimhi, and he said, and I quote, "A cornerstone in the planning of Jerusalem is the demographic question. That decision concerning the city's rate of growth serves today as one of the criteria for the success of the process of Jerusalem's consolidation as the capital of Israel." I think this statement is very clear. It is very straightforward. And based on plans like the Jerusalem 2020 plan and statements like Kimhi's statement here, the Israeli plans to displace Palestinians from Jerusalem started gaining momentum. So we have the first policy of land confiscation. Displacing people means uprooting them from the ground, which literally means taking away their lands and their roots from in Jerusalem. And so Israel starts immediately confiscating Palestinian lands legally. All of this happens legally under the Israeli law for various reasons. The first one is the construction of colonies, settlements all over the eastern part of Jerusalem. There are many tens of settlements, home to more than 214,000 settlers in the eastern part of Jerusalem alone. Now, these colonies are connected through a very well built and planned network of roads, colonial roads that don't only connect colonies inside the city, but also colonies outside of Jerusalem through Jerusalem to each other. So we have Road 60, which goes all the way to Nablus and Jenin. It cuts through the whole West Bank. It passes through Jerusalem and then continues as Road 90 all the way down to Hebron to the south. And so we see that these roads in Jerusalem especially are also built on Palestinian privately owned land that is confiscated by the Israeli occupation authorities, again, legally, because according to the law, a government has the right to confiscate privately owned land for the public benefit, for public projects. It's only that in this case, public and state projects like roads and infrastructure are working directly against a certain population. So dispossession and taking away Palestinian land was one of the main and most important policies. Land is also confiscated for military use, maybe not exactly in the middle of Jerusalem, but all over the West Bank, land is confiscated for military use. There is also in Jerusalem the phenomenon of national parks and municipal parks. Palestinians in Jerusalem lack the basic needs of survival, of land and enough housing opportunities, schools, infrastructure, economic centers, you name it. But we have lots of parks. These parks are another tool of dispossession. They are not for our welfare and our well-being. They are not for us to go out and see some green and have a break. They are there to take away more and more land from the Palestinian population. And so today we have 7 planned and existing national parks in the eastern part of Jerusalem alone. Looking at a map of these parks, you see that they are very strategically located where the Palestinian communities have the last bits and pieces of land for their own natural growth. So when you take away that little land that is left, the Palestinian community cannot grow any further because there is a colony to the west and there is a road to the east and there is a park to the south and there is another Palestinian neighborhood to the north. And so new couples, people who need new homes find themselves having to go out of their community and many times also outside of Jerusalem because this is similar to so many, to all Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And so again, displacing Palestinians by uprooting them literally. The other policy I would like to talk about is the policy of home demolition. So not only taking away Palestinian homes that belong to 48 refugees in the West, but also demolishing Palestinian homes in the 67 occupied eastern part systematically. It's not arbitrary. And again, it is used and it is explained and justified legally. The Israeli authorities claim that they demolish Palestinian homes in Jerusalem. Of course, they don't say Palestinian homes. They say we demolish homes in Jerusalem that were built illegally without a building permit. And again, it sounds like law and order, right? Someone might hear this and say, okay, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the Israeli occupation authorities reject 94% of the Palestinian applications for building permits. In other words, they are officially preventing us from building legally, pushing us to choosing one of 2 very bad options. One is to leave Jerusalem, go look for a legal place to live. I mean, there aren't many opportunities there as well. And the other option would be to take the risk of having your house demolished, of having to pay very high fines for illegal construction. So disempowerment, economic disempowerment, and again, uprooting, demolishing homes is a very important policy that is used in Jerusalem as well as in Area C in the West Bank. And in Jerusalem, since 1967, 5,000 structures were demolished in Jerusalem alone. 5,000 structures include businesses or economic structures or sometimes even stables or animal constructions, but also many homes. At least 2,000 Palestinian homes have been demolished in Jerusalem as a result of these policies.
Wow, thank you so much, Fayrouz. That was a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure it sounds like there's even more beyond those examples. I want to turn it over, Monique, as a professional planner, Are you hearing any rhymes in any of this? By the way, we do want to note that if anyone has any questions, if you're on the Zoom again, there is a Q&A button. And if you're on the Facebook Live, you can leave a comment there. And Monique.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fayrouz. There's just too many rhymes that it's heartbreaking, essentially. And some of the rhymes that I was hearing is confiscation of land for infrastructure type projects, and that further legitimizes and puts really in cement these lines in place. And so one of the rhymes that I heard is something that's key to San Diego's own history of freeway development. If we look at the history of City Heights in particular, and the placement of the 15 freeway, which confiscated land and homes from community members, again, in red zone areas and just right above the red zone area as well. Really, this infrastructure, and it took a fight from the community, much in part led by a community-based organization, City Heights CDC, to ensure that this freeway just didn't bypass community. And so there was a lot of hard-fought victories there in terms of having transit access, so people can then actually not just literally be run through, but that people can then connect to transportation regionally. And I know that's very similar to what's happening in Jerusalem specifically, as who has access to infrastructure and who doesn't, and who disproportionately bears the burden of that infrastructure as well. And so there's a rhyme there. Another rhyme I heard, again, in terms of these like absentee laws that are happening in Jerusalem, I just think about if we look at the city of San Diego and where vacant lots are concentrated, again, it's in these redlined communities. People are forced out either because they weren't given access to capital to reinvest in those communities, or even be able to purchase in those communities as well. And we're also seeing this phenomenon right now that is both racialized and also a classist system in which the same redlined areas are becoming gentrified because those prices have been so depressed that it creates a system in which those that have access to wealth and capital to come in and take those properties at very low rates. And then that is leading to the displacement of community members who have been there for multiple generations, or even new refugee and immigrant community members who are pushed further and further to the suburbs and to the outskirts of the city of San Diego that have limited access to infrastructure as well. I'll just highlight a couple other rhymes that I was hearing as well. Both San Diego and Jerusalem are major metropolitan areas that have border walls running through them, that have heavy militarization as well, and that from having a military presence, or even looking at where communities are being surveilled. So we have surveillance systems here, actually by no accident that a lot of these technologies are imported from the state of Israel here. And we look at where those cameras are, where communities are being policed. Again, it is right in these redlined communities as well. So we have that, and then we have a big military presence here with military base, and then the added layer of militarization with the border patrol. When we go in any direction of San Diego, we have these checkpoints as well. You have to, declare your citizenship or your legal access to space as well in any direction of San Diego. And there's just so many echoes there. And the last thing I would mention here as well is kind of, I think we might get to this in our next section, but really the theme park atmosphere in both areas, and thinking about who are the individuals in which these areas of play and tourism, who are the individuals that provide essentially the human infrastructure to keep it in place. Again, it's folks that are getting paid very poorly, and who are currently residing in these red line areas to support and prop up certain industries for this area as well. There's many other echoes, but I'll just pause there because I definitely want to get to the questions and hear what more that Fayrouz has to share as well.
Thank you, Monique. Yes. So as we will shift gears again, and we are going to be stopping to ask for questions in about 10 minutes. So thank you for bearing with us if you've asked a question. For the next section, I wanted to share my screen just one more time as we shift the topic to economic colonization and the impact of tourism. And so I'm sharing my screen here. This is a map you'll find on sandiego.com, I believe, sandiego.org, which is, a tourist marketing project here in San Diego. And if you're from San Diego and you're familiar with any of those, what we are seeing are now redlined, historically redlined neighborhoods such as City Heights, Southeast, you'll notice that they're not mentioned on this map. And you'll also notice that they're not mentioned on either of these maps. This one on the left is the official map from the Tourism Marketing District of San Diego. The one on the right is one I just, if you Google visit San Diego, this is one of the top hits that you'll find. And again, complete erasure or invisibilizing of many communities. And this one I thought was the most stark example of this, where there's really only 5 things that are even indicated on this map, and all of them would be the spaces that are highly theme parkified, I think is the term. And so I do also want to reflect on a quote that came out of, there's a very often cited book here in San Diego. It's called Under the Perfect Sun, The San Diego Tourists Don't See, by Mike Davis, Kelly Mayhew, and Jim Miller. And there's a quote from the introduction I just want to say before I key this last question off, which is war, tourist spectacle, and endangered descent. These are the 3 perennial axes of modern San Diego history: war, tourist spectacle, and endangered descent. And so with that, I'd like to ask Fayrouz for your response to that sort of framing.
Again, rhymes all over the place. If you allow me, I want to show everyone the city center map that the Israeli municipality has on its website for tourists. And maybe don't know how to enter full screen, but I think you can see it. And if we look at this map, you can see the old city here. The old city is the city center. The old city is the original city center. This highway next to the main road, right next to the highway, is sitting on the green line. So just to give you the context based on the other maps, everything to the left of this line is the western part of occupied Jerusalem. Everything to the right, to the east, is the eastern part occupied in 67. And as you can see, in the center of this map is not the old city, is not the city center. It is the center of the western part of Jerusalem. It is the colonial economic center of Jerusalem. It is where the restaurants are. It is where the hotels are. It is where the shopping areas are. It's not the original city center, which would be here. I mean, the Mount of Olives is not even fully on this map, and it's probably the most important touristic attraction after the old city. And so erasing Palestinians from the map literally is not just erasing them from the city, but also this connection between tourism industry, and colonialism. In Jerusalem, it's a very clear case of these 2 components working hand in hand. And of course, any sort of development that happens in Jerusalem is following the colonial agenda and the colonial plans, but also in tourism. As you can see, before I stop the sharing, TripAdvisor fully adopts this map, and this is a hint at international complicity, because global and international search engines, whether it is Google, of course, Google Maps. I mean, I even noticed on the first map you showed, on the landscape photo, it had a few points on the map, and they were all either Jewish sites or Israeli sites, but of course no mention of any Palestinian names or Arabic names. And so Google Maps, TripAdvisor, Lonely Planet, Airbnb, Booking.com, and all of the rest, they all follow very loyally the Israeli agenda and do not question at all maps or lists of hotels and lists of things to do in Jerusalem. That if you look at these guides and you look at these search engines, then usually they will also, just like the Zionist ones, they will encourage you to go to the city center. They will encourage you to spend your money in the city, in the western part. They will encourage you to spend your money in the western part. Looking at this map, anyone who has no knowledge about the situation here, let's say someone wants to visit the Holy Land, they are not aware of the political context in the Holy Land and how unholy the situation is, they would look at this map and think, okay, I should find myself a hotel around here. This is where the fun is. This is where I should be spending my time. Looking at other maps of Jerusalem, I'm sorry, I don't have them on my computer, you would see how literally on this side, there are street names and facilities and icons of many things and places to see and visit. While if you look at the eastern part where the Palestinian communities are, there would be not enough names of streets or icons of places to go visit and see, businesses to go, stay at hotels or eat at restaurants. This is all erased from Israeli maps and Israeli tour guides. So to take a step back, just to talk about also how not only by diverting the movement of tourists and not only by stealing tourism from the eastern part, there are so many Israeli colonial projects that come in the disguise of touristic projects. First of all, there are the parks, the national parks. Again, the first national park to be declared in Jerusalem after '67 was the I think it's called the Old City Walls Jerusalem Park. It is a park that was declared on the lands immediately around the Old City Walls, where many Palestinian shops used to exist. And as a national park, this means it has to be a scenic area. It is a green zone. And so no homes, no businesses. Declaring them where Palestinian lives means that this is displacing Palestinians. The last or most recent Israeli project I would like to cover, there are many, but I would like to focus on one, is the Jerusalem cable car project. I love cable cars and I think they are cool, but this one is very ugly because it clearly comes not for providing tourists a great experience of Jerusalem. It doesn't come even to bring any economic benefit to Israel itself. There were Israeli voices against this project when it was declared, saying it's gonna cost us $50 million or 50 million shekels, but it's not going to benefit us. It's not going to bring that money in return. And this, of course, proves that there are other reasons behind this cable car, and they are not economic. They are very colonial. The cable car will run from the west to the east, from the western part to the eastern part. So it will start in the German colony, which is in the southwestern part of Jerusalem, southern west part of Jerusalem. And it will basically take people all the way directly to a settler-controlled national park in the middle of Silwan, which is the Palestinian neighborhood right south of the Old City. So not into Silwan as a community, not into Silwan streets and history, but into the colonial hub inside Silwan, which is an official Israeli national park, the only Israeli national park that is actually managed by a settler organization. Again, showing the importance of settlement and colonialism in Jerusalem and how Israel bends its own laws and criteria whenever it fits the colonial agenda. Now, from the city of David, this is the name of the National Park and Visitor Center. Please do read about it. Al-Quds is the settler organization that runs it. It's a notorious settler organization in charge of displacing Palestinians, evicting families from their homes in Silwan, giving these homes to Jewish settlers. Now, from the City of David Visitor Center, this cable car will take you all the way up to the Mount of Olives. But you don't walk through the Palestinian communities where these sites are located. You fly above them. And from the City of David, you go to the next colony, which is the Ma'aleh Hazitim colony in Ras Al Amud on the Mount of Olives. From there, you can walk through a promenade that will be built for tourists, right at the border, actually inside the border of the big Jewish cemetery that is on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. So again, you're not walking as a visitor, as a tourist in the streets of Ras Al Amud or Tur or other Palestinian communities on the Mount of Olives. You are walking through a cemetery from one settlement to the next settlement. You will finish your hike and your walk at the next settlement on top of the Mount of Olives, which is called Beit Ha'orot. From there, you walk back the promenade, take the cable car back to the western part. Now, what does this do? And how is this colonial? And how is this beneficial to Israel? First of all, politically, as a tourist, you don't walk in Palestinian communities, you don't see them, which means you don't see everything we have been talking about so far: infrastructure, intentional neglect, displacement, dispossession, demolitions, garbage in the streets, demolished homes, no parks for little communities, but huge parks that don't benefit the communities on the lands they need for their own natural growth. You will not see that. So politically, they hide away the occupation. All you see is very developed and very modern Israeli settler sites, like the City of David, like the settlements on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. And so you don't see the occupation, and politically this means you are not, you don't move and mobilize against it. And then again, there is the economic benefit, which is not the income that the Israeli occupation will make, but rather the disempowerment of the Palestinian communities. Because when you, as a visitor to Jerusalem, don't see me on the map when you are planning, or on the search engine when you are planning your trip, so you don't see Palestinian hotels, and you probably would book an Israeli hotel, and then planning your hikes and tours and sightseeing all will follow the Israeli agenda, which is again followed loyally by international agendas. And then you don't make it to our businesses. You don't come to our hotels. You don't come to our restaurants. You don't come to our markets and shopping centers. And so economic disempowerment of the Palestinian population is the Israeli economic gain. It is a political gain. It is not an economic gain as in putting more dollars in their pockets. We have your government to do that for them, unfortunately. But this allows them to create such projects here that walk hand in hand with colonial goals in Jerusalem that aim at the displacement of as many Palestinians as possible.
Thank you again. I see already so many parallels. I do want to hand it over to Monique, but I also just want to interject one more piece of just context as we're thinking about our specific communities of San Diego and Jerusalem, which is that both our military economies and tourist economies are very large. And I know, Fayrouz, you mentioned that there's over 200,000 settlers in the area. Here in San Diego, we have 110,000 active military in our community, in our central communities. And at the same time, both cities see millions and millions of tourists each year. And so I do want to turn it over to Monique to talk a little bit about this idea of commodification and public space. Before I think after that, we will shift gears to talking about the book and then open for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Oren, and Fayrouz, thank you for that context, because Matt, when you were talking, I'm writing through all these notes because there's just so many similarities, and just thinking about even the maps that both you and Oren shared about what's highlighted and what's erased or what's hidden. And you said that these maps and the way the narrative of the landscape is told, and even physically the infrastructure that's put in place to also erase and shield. You talked about the hiding of the occupation. I certainly saw that when my wife took me to Israel, Palestine. as well. And I see that here in San Diego as well, is the hiding of the disinvestment. When tourists do come, they don't get to always experience the richness that a barbecue place in Southeast San Diego could provide, or that the pupusa place in Logan Heights provides, or the taco shop in Barrio Logan, or the pho place in City Heights can provide, right? Or amazing, like, Ethiopian food. And so there's also then, like you've mentioned, Fayrouz, there's economic disempowerment that is existing and being reinforced by these maps that seem very benign, very unharmful, but they reinforce these narratives of what is worthy to visit, who is worthy to patronize, who you need to fear or stay away from those neighborhoods. And it reinforces, essentially, again, white supremacy. It reinforces these narratives that date back of hundreds of years, and being happening in the landscape. And so you see places like here in San Diego, reinventions like Old Town San Diego, Little Italy, or Seaport Village, or even the Gaslamp Quarter, where these spaces become commodified culture. And what you're seeing here is, if it cannot be commodified, then you will be erased from place. And I do want to lift up the Kumeyaay people. Like, do we have markers of important, significant Kumeyaay sacred places even within our own city? Do we know the Kumeyaay people's not only historic but current relationship to place? And is that in the landscape at all anywhere? So there's multiple erasures happening here in San Diego, not only for Indigenous people and how things are laid out, and what even like what words are used on the street to describe places, but then there's also this erasure of the people, the workforce, which are Black and Brown individuals who prop up these systems and allow these systems to work. And the last thing I would say too, Fayrouz, that you brought up this thing about trash pickup, right? In Jerusalem. And we see that here as well. There was an ordinance here in the city of San Diego in I think early 1900s, 1910s, that basically allowed for highly subsidized trash pickup for single family housing, which was usually wealthier and white. And not provided the same level of care and intention for all those red line areas that we've been talking about here in San Diego. And you see that on the streets. You see that people have no place to put their trash, that people are filling up alleys with items that they don't have the ability to either transport to the landfill or the funding to pay the fee to drop that off. And so again, some communities are being subsidized infrastructure access, and others aren't, and they bear the burden to organize their own community cleanups, and to work with the city and even pay sometimes, or have the council office waive the fee to get the dumpster so that they could literally put on gloves as a community and clean up their own neighborhoods. And I know that my wife Avital has been a part of a number of those cleanups as well, and helping organize that. So there's just too many similarities that are just incredibly heartbreaking. And what I want to just kind of wrap this up in terms of this comment is that I think it's incredibly important for progressive elected officials or progressive candidates who are running for office here in San Diego to understand, who have been on the front lines of advocating for communities who haven't been getting that trash pickup, who've been on the front lines of advocating for communities who were getting freeways run through them and advocating for access to that infrastructure as well. It's important for them to understand that the colonial harm that is happening here is also linked to the colonial harm that is happening in Israel, Palestine. And so if those individuals go to Congress, it's important for them to see those similarities, because they are going to be in a position of privilege and power to uphold and keep accountable how the US spends their money and who they support and who they keep accountable. And so it's not enough to be progressive at home, but we must see that our liberation and colonial harm is linked and is no different. And so I just thank you so much, Fayrouz, for sharing all of that, and just really illuminated a lot of the connections between here and there.
And just a really quick follow-up, Monique. I know we also pulled out these maps and I forgot to share them, is around sort of some of these visible legacies of the redlining that you just kind of alluded to, in terms of the communities who are, if not commodified, then erased, but actually also these tourism industries depend on. If you wanted to make a comment.
Absolutely. So you see in these maps, you see the percentage of household earnings under 30,000. They follow the same red line areas here. You also see where the pollution burden is in the city and also throughout the county, again, right over the legacy of redlining. And then you're looking at also this map in the middle, COVID cases in the city and county-wide. Again, it's disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities and this, when we see these maps, this is the legacy and ongoing harm of redlining. So redlining is not a thing that I talk about in the past tense. It is an active lived experience in these communities still today.
Thank you for that. And Fayrouz, if you had any other responses or reflections, I'm also going to start to take a look at the audience questions right now.
Yes, I would like to just present very quickly our tourist guidebook to Jerusalem that we published in 2014, which we call Wujud. I have a copy here. This is the second edition that we published last year. We were supposed to be touring the US with it this fall, but with the COVID-19 closure and new reality, we had to move it to the virtual sphere. But Wujud, which is Arabic for existence or presence, is our Palestinian answer to that colonial policy of hiding and erasing Palestinian presence in Jerusalem. I will just speak about it very quickly. It is both a tourist guidebook to Jerusalem, but also a book about Jerusalem and Jerusalem's political reality, because we see that there is no, these two things, visiting Jerusalem and learning and knowing about Jerusalem, are two things that walk hand in hand as well. And knowing about political context would affect how you behave as a tourist. This is true for all places we visit around the world, but speaking about Jerusalem, Wujud helps people be ethical tourists and visitors in Jerusalem. So on the one hand, it provides practical tourist information to visitors. Exactly the information I was saying is erased from Israeli colonial maps and propaganda. So we tell people where they can stay in Jerusalem, where they can shop in Jerusalem, where they can eat and drink in Jerusalem, where they can hike in Palestinian communities, because no Israeli guide would tell you where you can hike in the eastern part of Jerusalem. So first, there is the practical information also about Jerusalem communities, or a bit more than 40 communities, Palestinian communities there are in the Jerusalem district, villages, neighborhoods, and 2 refugee camps. And when we talk about Jerusalem, we talk about the Jerusalem district and not the Jerusalem with its narrow borders that are under Israeli occupation today, but rather about Jerusalem and its northwest villages and its southwest villages and its eastern Bedouin communities and villages. And so Wujud, basically, if you remember the map that we show, and I showed you how many lines divide and fragment Jerusalem and Jerusalem Palestinians, Wujud unites the city again. Wujud presents the city as a whole, and it tells you what you can do and what you can see and how you can support Palestinian steadfastness and economy in it. In addition, there is a chapter about the Jerusalem story. All of the policies that we covered today and many others, because we focused on urban planning today, but legal status, legal issues, education, economy, again, tourism, it's all in Wujud. So there is a full chapter about the political context of the city for people who would like to be educated about it even without visiting. And lastly, a whole chapter is also dedicated to other Palestinian cities. So we tell people how they can be ethical tourists in other Palestinian cities. And in this case, we mean ethical tourists as in learning the history, learning the erased Palestinian narrative, seeing the Palestinian presence in these cities, and also supporting Palestinian economy and steadfastness. And it comes also with a map, which does not erase Palestinian presence. So it's the full map, the real map of Jerusalem, we call it arrogantly. And it does show people all of this information on a map as well. And I believe we just shared the link to Wujud for people to read more about it and hopefully buy it.
Yes, thank you so much. And the link is in the chat if you're on the Zoom, and we're going to be pasting it to the Facebook event as well. I don't think it's arrogant at all. I feel like as we've talked about this history of who has the power to author maps, to legislate, to build walls, right? Who has the legitimacy and the power to do so? I think that this is a beautiful response to that. We have a couple great questions here. I want to kind of invite both Monique, Fayrouz, anyone to answer. The first, aloha, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. Listening from Honolulu in the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii and hearing abundant rhymes. Wondering if the panelists could speak to the changes that both cities have seen with COVID-19 and how any economic recovery plans might be perpetuating or worsening conditions. And secondly, what local communities might be doing in resistance to further militarization, policing, or plans to rapidly reopen to tourism and putting workers at risk. Mahalo.
Should I go first, Monique? Okay, well, needless to say, times like these are very good for the Israeli occupation because they provide a cover. Pandemic or not, closure or not, colonial activities continue their business as usual. Colonial activities continue all the time. And speaking about the bigger and wider political context, COVID-19's crisis was also an example of how the Israeli occupation took advantage of these conditions in order to not only continue with its policies, but also enhance its control and firm its grip over the Palestinians in Jerusalem. So in Jerusalem, for example, despite the lockdown, despite the fact that many sectors in the labor market were shut down during the first closure in March, the Israeli occupation authorities deemed the construction sector a crucial sector for the economy, so it was not shut down. Now, first of all, because Israel wants to speed up its colony building, constructions in colonies, construction of infrastructure. In Jerusalem specifically, it is the light rail, the tram in Jerusalem, which is something I forgot to mention when we covered policies, but public transportation, of course, bus lines, bus networks, tram lines. There is one now in Jerusalem with 4 new ones planned and under construction currently. All of them clearly aim at connecting settlements from around Jerusalem to the city center, making it more compelling to settlers, to Israelis to go live in settlements, knowing that there is a tram that will take them downtown within 10-15 minutes, so an incentive for settlement. And so we saw that the construction in colonies, building homes for settlers, paving roads for settlers, transport and infrastructure of transport actually was speeded up during the coronavirus and not slowed down. And again, keep in mind, as Monique was saying before, who does the hard labor in Palestine? It is the Palestinians, it is the people of color, it is Palestinians, it is immigrants, it is even within the Israeli society, but mostly Palestinians. And Palestinians build homes in settlements, and Palestinians are the ones who are working on the tram infrastructure, roads infrastructure. And so it's a double gain, because it's also no one's health is important here. Their health, the risk they would be taken of contracting the virus, the threat to their health was not something that Israel could care less about. And so this sector continued as usual. But again, of course, like many places, like everywhere around the world, the moment of COVID-19 was used also to further the militarization and policing. So for example, here it is the Israeli army. I am not sure how we call it. There is the front and there is the back front. I don't know how we call it in military terms. I'm sorry.
The rear guard.
Maybe, but dealing with Corona was in the hands of the army. I mean, the whole organizing of Corona, fighting Corona, is in the hands of the army institution. And there is probably no other reason than enhancing that control over the population. In addition, we witnessed, for example, the Israeli occupation army going into neighborhoods that are totally neglected during normal times. So for example, Kufr Aqab is part of the municipal boundaries. The Israeli occupation does not provide any services whatsoever to the people living in Kufr Aqab, even though it is within municipal boundaries. It is locked behind the wall, and no services are given to these residents, who, by the way, pay their taxes all the time. But during the first lockdown in March or April, we saw more than once the Israeli army going into this neighborhood at the pretense that they are there to uphold the lockdown. So they received complaints and they are coming to tell people to stay at home. So you see a place that the Israeli occupation neglects all year long, but when there is a chance to go there and prove again who the boss is, who controls this area, then they used it for that as well. I mean, there are many other answers or parts to this answer, but I would like to allow also Monique to speak and for us to have other questions.
Fayrouz, thank you so much for sharing all that. Again, I was just taking notes here as you were talking. I really appreciate you really just calling out that, really saying the Colonial project continues, right? And we're seeing that here as well. The Colonial project of the border wall continues, but also the resistance continues as well. And so I'm just going to share my screen here to highlight some of that resistance that's happening. We owe immense thanks and gratitude to the Kumeyaay people who have been at the forefront of ongoing resistance, specifically around the border wall itself. I encourage you to take a look at their Instagram handle to find out opportunities on how you can get engaged and contribute to that. Also, the legal defense in order to help support the legal efforts of the Kumeyaay people as well, I encourage you to take a look at and contribute through their Venmo. And then there's also a call to action happening this Monday, October 12th at 7 a.m. where folks are going to meet at the Golden Acorn Casino off the 8 and then travel to do an action at the wall. So the Colonial project continues, but so does the resistance, and same here and the same there. And so with that as well, in terms of like economic terms of how COVID-19 is rolling out, you see in terms of the city budget, right, where the majority of the departments in the city were cut back by 10% of the budget because there was a great decrease of tourism, right, the last quarter. And so the city needed to make up for that shortfall, and really decreased departments pretty much across the board by 10%, except the police department. They got an increase from their previous budget of 100 million. And I won't go into the details of that, but I think that shows a lot in terms of what is valued within these government institutions, and where they see what would really best assist the community here. The other thing I'd mention too, in terms of the economic impacts, you have seen here locally, mutual, a county-wide mutual aid network that is run by all volunteers, which I know Oren is really deeply involved in, and he could definitely share more and probably put a link in the chat box for folks who are interested locally and how to get involved in that. And it's really people stepping up where these institutions have failed the community, and really supporting people in the ways that they need to be supported. There was, I don't believe it's still something that's happening in San Diego, but there was a moratorium on evictions for people who couldn't pay rent. But organizations, again, and I mentioned this organization before, City Heights CDC and others, who are raising money to literally pay people's rent so they could stay in their homes. There's other organizations like LISC who are providing small businesses grants so they could literally pay their workforce and pay the rent so to keep their doors open. But the business community, particularly small Black and non-Black people of color owned businesses here, are really worried about this moment providing that door to open even wider for land speculators to come and really take over huge swaths of that property. So really the need for also policies to protect both residents and small business owners from that land grab from happening is going to need to happen moving forward. And I know that there's a number of folks that are working on those issues locally who have, even before COVID, those were crises these communities were facing. But like as Fayrouz mentioned, these crises kind of become more amplified and accelerated, but also at the same time become kind of hidden because the attention is on a public health crisis, which is important that it is, but also understanding that all these things are interlinked. And when we even looked at the map of who's being most impacted from deaths and illness from COVID, it's the same communities that are being rapidly displaced from those neighborhoods. And all these things cannot be looked at in silos. They must be looked at as interconnected elements of a colonial system. And we must challenge those in solidarity here locally from all those different angles, but also in solidarity on an international front as well.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Monique. And I also want to say that we've, in your last two responses, Fayrouz and Monique, you answered several more of the questions that have been asked. And there's a couple more that we won't have time to get to. It is the half an hour in. This is the end of today's panel. I do want to thank tremendous thank you to Grassroots Al-Quds, Grassroots Jerusalem, Fayrouz. If you'd like to have some closing remarks, this is a fundraiser. We do hope that you'll, if not, donate to that book. There's a link that's going to be dropped in to donate just to the organization, as opposed to if you don't want to purchase the book, you can still donate. You can donate monthly to make sure that you support this crucial, important work. San Diego stands with Jerusalem. And Fayrouz, I'll give you the last word. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll continue from where Monique stopped actually, and just say that it is clear to us at Grassroots Al-Quds. I mean, again, you were saying public health case or issue, but of course it's very political as well. And I think that COVID-19 is a moment, a reminder to everyone that oppression around the world is connected and oppressors are connected. They are supporting each other. And we are resisting the same enemy, and that is capitalism and imperialism. And I think that moments like COVID-19, moments like a webinar about parallels between San Diego and Jerusalem, this could be any other two names from around the world. I think this should be a reminder to everyone that we need not only to support each other's movements and grassroots mobilization, but we also need to build that global network that is resisting this global network of capitalists that are oppressing and dispossessing and disempowering us around the world. So that's the closing remark. And thank you for sharing the links. We are an organization that is building a model of economic independency and full self-sufficiency. We generate income in order to free ourselves from conditional funding. And we also invite people who appreciate our work and believe in it to help us, even with really small amounts, but to build our own network of supporters that will also free us and liberate us from a totally different colonization we did not cover today, and that is international aid and donor systems. Thank you.
And just one quick last comment from Ed, and then we'll close the feed. 1 second, Ed, you've got to unmute. Oh, let's see. There we go.
Well, maybe this will be just a sweet story about maps in Palestine. My other organization besides JVP is Karama, and every year Karama rents a booth at the California Social Studies Conference. They've been canceled because of COVID, but we've been doing it for many years. They provide the audience of virgin brains, you know, lots of people who don't know anything about. Have a beautiful table with books and so on, and a tray of baklava, that lovely sweet dessert, with a sign over it called Baklava Contest. And on the table, we have a contemporary map of the Middle East. And people come over and we say, would you like to enter the contest? Well, sure. If you can find Palestine on this map, you'll get a piece of our baklava. And they look for a few seconds, look up and smile with recognition. Palestine is not on that map. They get their baklava. It opens up conversation for us, and we're reaching a teacher who might go back and reach 150 students. So I encourage activists who are watching to get in the game of going to these conferences. It's a powerful tool.
All right, thank you very much. And we're ending the live now.